I took over as director of the University Press back in July of 2011. As I count down my remaining months in this office, I find myself looking back on the past 4 years and the 150 excellent titles that we have thus far published in creative writing and scholarship both. Without a doubt, among the titles that I'm proudest of are the books we are featuring today. The product of decades of painstaking research and translation work by a team of researchers from the UP Visayas, admirably headed by Professor Emeritus Alicia P. Magos. This epic series marks a singular moment in the history of Philippine publishing, for it presents in textual form the irreplaceable wisdom and communal lore of the Panay Bukidnon people. This is the first time that such a substantive oral corpus has been recovered, transcribed, translated into 3 languages, and subsequently published in our country. I'm very happy to see that Professor Magos is here and is able to join us as we celebrate the 3 volumes, Tikum, Kadlum, Amburukay, and the one we're launching today, Derikaryong Pada. Our people's epics are, of course, forms of native mythological knowledge, and it would do us well as a nation to preserve and cherish them in the modern medium of the written word. While the technologizing of the spoken word can't help but transform it away from the provisionality of performance into the stasis of print, so actually we have to acknowledge the fact that once we record it and transcribe it and publish it, we've transformed it somehow. These books hopefully document, nevertheless, something of the original experience of this native community's primordial and mythic world. Needless to say, mythology is a form of spiritual orature, oral literature, if you may say that, which has provided human beings one of the oldest paths to the divine. Myth represents in ritual, narrative, and symbolic forms intuitions of the spiritual realm, and it has done so from the earliest times. The basic theme of all myths is that there is an invisible reality that supports the visible world. Mythology, in this sense, is fundamentally mystical in character, rendering into images the amorphous essence of all things through which it can be experienced and known. We may then see myth as a creative and imaginal field whose referent in the ultimate sense is transcendent. Its purpose is to enable us to experience the world that opens to us the spiritual dimension that enfolds it. Myths make us realize the mystical presence in everyone and in everything, for according to their deepest insight, we have all been poured out of the Creator's eternal self. We are all manifestations of the one divinity. But myth also has other functions. Like science, myth describes for us the various shapes and textures of reality. Unlike science, however, it more easily accedes to the realization that what is real is ultimately unknowable. And then we may also say that myths serve a didactic or pedagogical purpose as well. They provide individuals residing in their specific communities guides or manuals on how to live under whatever conditions. Finally, myth also serves to legitimate the social order as it exists. It's in this sense that myths are culturally bound as well as place-specific. They are entirely the products of their own time and circumstance. The problem, however, is when you reduce myths only to that level, the sociological function of myth, to the neglect of the mystical function. The moment we understand that our stories about God are myths, the moment we see that our religions proffer or offer not literal truths but rather symbolic and spiritual ones, then our faith can be set free from the cultural prisons of fundamentalist ethnocentrism and literal-mindedness. The comparative study of myth makes us see that the various myths, actually all religions, are at once false and true. False, because what they give us are mere symbolic images or metaphors, which by definition cannot be facts, cannot be literally true. But true, precisely because these very same metaphors gesture toward the one transcendent mystery. All these insights are in full and splendorous evidence in the Sugidanon, which are descriptive not so much of the Panay Bukidnon's world as expressive of their aspirations, chiefest of which is the vision that not only recognizes duality, but also, and more importantly, yearns to transcend it. Indeed, in these stories, and this is my own reading, the sky world and the earth world are not divided, but actually interpenetrate one another, their creatures freely trafficking across these non-absolute and proximal realms. Even the distinctions of gender and enmity prove to be mutable. Femaleness shifts into maleness if it must, and the enemy or the other is actually inextricably part of the same, is even shockingly its blood relation, if only you allow yourself to look more closely. Finally, evil can be good, too, once you intuit past the surface of the apparent into the hidden and implicit depth. In like manner, there's really no conflict between the body and the spirit, as can be intuited from the way these stories perceive and present the truth of human sexuality, namely that it is nature's entirely beautiful, indeed its precious and altogether golden gift. Moreover, in Tikum, Kadlum, and Amburukay, we can see the mythical motive of the one forbidden thing that resonates with the story of the Edenic garden and its mortally faithful tree. There's that motive in all myths, the one forbidden thing. In the first book, it's Tikum Kadlum, the Datu's enchanted black dog warns his master, the dog talks to the master, warns his master against cutting down the sacred bamboo in the middle of the magical forest. In the second, Labodonggon's parents warn their son not to carry out his plan to steal the monster woman's glittery pubic hair, for such an act would surely bring about disaster. Of course, the moment something is explicitly forbidden in a myth, we can expect it to be transgressed. For this is precisely how the plot of powerful stories, ancient as well as modern, may be said to unfold. Then as now, a perfect paradise has little or no narrative interest. The stasis and equanimity of the ordinary world will need to be disturbed if the heroic journey should commence. That's why the plot unfolds, because the transgression has to happen. So I'm sorry, we couldn't have stayed in Eden. There would have been no story. Perhaps the most interesting idea in these epics is that of the tuos, or sacred pact, embodied in this pre-literate world, not in any written contract, but rather in actual tangible objects that are thereby invested with spiritual potency and incalculable worth. Given this form of mystical mnemonics, it's really a mnemonic device to us. It's an object that carries with it the power of the honor of your own word. It's a pact. So it's a mnemonic device. We are reminded of the psychodynamics of oral consciousness, which is situational, sympathetic, and participatory, rather than abstract and individualistic. Moreover, evident in the language of these epics is the fact that oral thinking, in the words of the historian Walter J. Ong, is immediate and close to the life world, and is at once copious and voluble. No wonder you have so many adjectives. It's copious and voluble, madaldal. Kasi oral consciousness pa siya. Which is to say, the plenitude of their thought pictures helps keep the listener focused and attentive, on one hand. And on the other, the structure of their epic utterance, as with other examples of folklore, rests on additive and iterative sentence patterns, repetitive sentence patterns. Obviously, these exist for the purpose of easier recall, represented best in the Sugidanon's habitual formula, where we ended was where we paused. Yes. Uulit-ulit yan. Kasi, they end the chanting, and then they pick up later, and then that's the first thing that the chanter will say. Where we ended the last time, that was where we stopped the episode. Now we begin again. Okay? Of course, what these self-same qualities finally tell us is that oral cultures are living and dynamic social formations in their own right. Despite being pre-analytical, orality is a mode of consciousness that is eminently capable of generating as well as nurturing its own profound forms of thought. There are, of course, limitations to orality. You cannot quite think in abstract or categorical terms if you're purely oral. And I think our problem as a nation is that we are, in fact, enduringly and residually oral. It's so hard. If you watch General Luna, for example, poor General Luna, very literate, educated in Europe, like Rizal and all our other literate heroes. It's no accident that many of them were extremely literate, trying to argue for a nation that was an abstraction that no one else could actually grasp. Because you need that kind of literal, categorical mind that can embrace the abstraction of the nation that's bigger than the family or even the region. I'm sorry, but Emilio Aguinaldo kept lapsing back to regionalism. He couldn't quite understand this big concept of the nation, not yet, anyway. And I think we're still grappling with that, because how come so many of our politicians steal? And how come so many of our government officials violate the sacred trust that we give them? They don't really know, or they don't really love the nation, because it's abstract for them. So, what does it mean? I think that writers are on the forefront of bringing this dream of the nation into reality, because writers are the ones who actually love that kind of ability to think in categorical terms. I think writers and lawyers, except lawyers fight for categories, di ba? The law is written, the letter of the law, di ba? But you know, many of them are, never mind. Writers na lang. Okay, let me conclude. In fact, the ideas of harmony and unification between humanity and nature, or the worldly and the divine on one hand, and between the conflicting interests of different groups of human beings on the other. These are priceless bequests that these stories continue to offer us. In the face of a fractious and divided country, these are insights that Filipinos all need to embrace and to champion more and more. This is especially true now, when so many of our Lumad brothers and sisters in Mindanao are being imperiled by militarization and armed insurgency, the mineral resources of their ancestral domains becoming the object of corporate avarice and state-sponsored capitalist exploitation. By becoming more deeply aware of the rich oral traditions of our indigenous peoples, and by learning about and actualizing their mystical realizations about our spiritual oneness as a nation, Filipinos in general will be able to recognize and respect the difference of our indigenous brethren, whose well-being and interests we will now see as being ultimately inseparable from our own, and whose identity coincides with the otherness living inside ourselves. These epics remind us that we were all Lumad once upon a time. Because of their enduring value as gifts of the creative imagination, through which empathy or solidarity becomes possible and may finally be realized as a collective truth, the Sugidanon also tell us that right in the marrow of our mythic bones, despite the epistemic violence of history, the luminous chant still croons that we are Lumad, still and all. Again, a pleasant morning to everyone.